Hello again to all of you out there in YouTube and Facebook land, to all prophecyfulfilled.com on the World Wide Web, and on Facebook and on YouTube, simply all prophecy fulfilled. Okay, we are in the midst of my series. I've titled it The Last Days, Biblically Defined. We're on part 6. And here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to make this very short and very sweet, because I'm going to call this the halftime report. And all I want to do today is I want to quickly review what we've done up to this point. I'm going to deal with some objections that I've received, and I want to clarify a couple things before we move on. Okay, so here's your 60-second review. We began by establishing a starting point on which we can all agree upon, and that consisted of 3 agreements from 3 questions. Number 1, the Bible alone defines its own terms. I think we all agree upon that. Number 2, the Bible teaches a coming or a second appearing after the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. And that coming, that second appearing, was future to the New Testament writers. Number 3, the Bible teaches that this coming, this second appearing, would occur in the last days. That's our starting point. Then we looked at the definitions of 2 actual Hebrew words akorith and the words kates. And we see those words in our Old Testament translated as latter, latter times, latter end, time of the end, and so on and so forth. Then we determined that we're going to go through the entire Bible, and we're going to start in Genesis, and we're going to allow the Bible, and only the Bible, to establish a working definition of the last days, so that as we proceed, as we move forward, the Bible alone, again, the Bible alone would develop the concept of the last days for us. So that would allow the Bible to fill in the details as to the when and the where and the why and the who of the last days. Well, why are we going to do it this way? Well, because Scripture alone defines the terms. That's why. Okay, so thus far we have gone through Deuteronomy. And up to this point, the only reference up to this point to a last days is the last days of Old Covenant Israel. The last days of the 12 tribes of Jacob, the last days of the Mosaic economy, and that nation as a nation in covenant with God. Okay, and that's it. There's no reference to the end of a church age. There's no reference to the end of planet Earth. Simply the end of a covenant people when God would bring in a new covenant. That's it, my friends. That's the only last days definition given us in Scripture thus far. And that's really important to keep that in mind as we move forward. So number 2, I want to clarify a couple things, and I need to answer a couple questions here that I've had on Facebook and YouTube. Number 1 has to do with the actual, what I'm going to call the dictionary definition of the last or latter days. Okay, so there was a gentleman on Facebook in one of my threads that I had posted, and he was actually discussing this with another individual. It wasn't me. But there was a disagreement as to the actual definition of the last days. Okay, so what he did is he cited the definition. He took Strong's dictionary, which you can get online from Bible Hub or Blue Letter Bible or anything like that. He took the actual definition. I think he copy and pasted it, and he said, okay, here's the definition. And he took the word, it's like, the number 319 latter, which means the last or the end or the after part or the hindermost, which would be the farthermost point. And then after he cites the definition, and I don't get this, here's what he says. I'm going to quote. He says, from this definition, okay, this is the very one that I've given you early on in the series. From this definition, we see that latter means second half. No, we don't see that. I don't understand why he says that. The definition that he actually cited, which was the proper one, he looks like he copy and pasted it, it says absolutely nothing about a second half. I don't understand how we can say that. And then he went on to ask, second half of what? See, he's trying to justify his definition. He says, second half of what? If you break up all of history as being before Christ's death and after Christ's death, we have the former days and the latter last days. Pretty simple. And then later on, he kind of concludes his point that he's trying to make. He says, the term latter days is simply the second age. The first being before Christ, the second being after Christ. Okay. Do you see what he's doing here? He's assigning the entire church age as the last days. And this simply is not biblically tenable. And quite frankly, it's not even sensible. So it's as if he's taking a timeline. He's drawing this timeline and he's kind of splitting it down the middle. And he's saying, okay, this is the first, so this must be the last, okay? And this is kind of silly. And this really isn't thinking critically about the text. I think here's what's going on. This individual, I think like many, he has this learned, built-in, preconceived idea of what he's been taught the last days must look like and that they are in our future. Okay, so what he has to do is he has to mold a definition of the last days that conforms to his already belief system or his theology, okay? And the strange thing to me is, and this is what I don't understand, is that he actually cites the actual, what we'll call the dictionary definition, and then he ignores it. And that doesn't make sense to me. See, we can't start with a theology. We can't start with a belief system, probably one that we've most likely inherited from, those who have taught us, and we're all guilty of that. And then we can't have that and then go to our Bibles and then read it in such a way that to make the Bible agree with what we already believe, as if we're trying to prove what we think we already know. We can't do that. We go to the Bible first with an open, humble, honest mindset. I know that's hard to do sometimes, and we allow the Bible to define the terms and the concepts for us. That's what we do, and then out of that, we form a theology. Out of that, we form a belief system. And that's why I have proposed we start in Genesis and we move through the text. We move through Scripture. Okay, so here's a question. If you've watched this series thus far, has any reference to last days that we've covered through Deuteronomy mentioned a second half of anything? No. The only latter days that the Bible has shown us thus far are the last days specifically to God's old covenant people. And look, I want to be clear here. In a sense, we can divide history in two parts if you'd like to do that. And you can say, okay, you have before and after Christ. You can do that. That's fine. But here's the question. What part of history, what part of redemptive history would be more a better way of putting it, what part of redemptive history was said to come to an end or come to a close according to the prophets? And what part of history was coming to an end according to the New Testament writers? Okay? See, it was that last section of time. It was a time period. It was a specific time period within an age. Okay? At the very end of that age. Well, what age? Well, it was the old covenant age that was experiencing the last days. It wasn't the entire age, much less the church age. In addition to being honest with what the actual, what we'll call the dictionary definitions of words are, I think we really have to look at the word within the contextual setting that we're looking at in the text itself to see how it's being used in that text. That's what we need to do. So we have one eye kind of on the dictionary definition, if you will, but you also have to have another eye on the contextual definition, so to speak. And I don't think this individual, quite honestly, who came up with this definition of first half, second half, has done either of these two things, in my opinion. So now let me just for a minute, I want to kind of see if I can maybe employ a little common sense here in the form of an example, okay? And maybe this will help. So say that I'm watching a football game with my buddy. And our team is highly favored. We're undefeated. This other team, not so much, okay? It's halftime, and we're ahead. My team's ahead 7-6. Now, I kind of look over to my buddy. I say to him, I get the feeling, I'm a little bit nervous here, because I get the feeling that this team is just going to kind of hang around all game long, and they're going to steal it away from us right there near the end, the last part of the game. Well, lo and behold, the game continues on, and we come to the 2-minute warning. Okay, well, what do I do? Well, it's still 7-6, by the way. So I kind of look over to my friend with a wry grin, and I say, hey, remember what I said earlier, at halftime? 7-6, they've got the ball. Okay, so just use some common sense here and consider the plain use of language. What is considered the latter end, or how about the latter minutes of that football game? Is it the entire second half? Or would it more likely be the last 2 minutes? What's the latter end? I mean, you know the answer to this. This isn't difficult. The last 2 minutes, the last section of time, okay, the last section of time that comes right before the end of the ball game, okay? These are the latter minutes of the game, not the entire second half. Okay, so again, you can divide up redemptive history, into before and after Christ. That's fine, but you would be correct to put those halves as far as redemptive history as the Mosaic age and the Messianic age. And then you need to ask yourself, of these two ages, which one was prophesied to have the latter days? Which one was said to ultimately come to an end? Yeah, the Mosaic age. Okay, so folks, the only last days taught in the Bible are the last days of Israel. Okay, when Messiah came, he died on the cross, he established his kingdom, he crushed his enemies under his feet through the work of the church in that first century generation, that 40-year transitional period between the Mosaic age, which was coming to a close, and the Messianic age, Messianic kingdom, which had been established. Okay, so finally, I have had a couple people say, okay, Ryan, we get your point. And you know what? We actually agree. In fact, you don't have to go through the rest of the Old Testament. Just get to the New Testament stuff. Okay, and here's why. Because even if the Old Testament, even if that only talks about the last days of Israel, the last days of that old covenant, that really doesn't prove your point, Ryan. That doesn't mean that you're right, because the New Testament talks about new promises that are specific, specifically for the church. The New Testament is kind of separate, from Israel. Israel was the old, the church is the new. The New Testament's doing something different or separate, or it's been added to that old kind of stuff, or something like that. And God's going to deal with Israel in the future. Okay, so first of all, if you concede that the Old Testament only speaks of the last days of Old Covenant Israel, well, you are correct in that, but that's actually a fatal flaw to your futurist perspective if you carry it out to its conclusion. So if you stick with me here, you will see in this series, you will see that the last days of Israel, get this, were exactly all that the New Testament writers were teaching, and we're preaching, and we're proclaiming. That was their message, okay? The message of the prophets. That was the last days spoken of by all the prophets before them. There's no separate Old Testament, New Testament message. The message of the prophets, I guess what I'm trying to say, was the message of Messiah. The message of Messiah was salvation. And that very salvation was the salvation that the New Testament writers were saying that was about to come. The truth of the matter is, they knew that the salvation foretold by the prophets was soon to be revealed with the coming of Messiah, which was in their generation. And that's what I'm really trying to say. So here's what I'm going to do moving forward in this series. I'm actually going to speed this thing up a bit, because I've been told, okay, you don't need to go into such detail into some of these Old Testament passages. You know what? That's fine. I'm going to speed this up a bit. But I'm still going to move forward from Deuteronomy, but in a much faster fashion, and we will arrive in the New Testament here in a couple segments. But my offer still stands. Here's my offer. if you would please, if you think that there is one passage, one verse, one area in the Old Testament that actually speaks of or teaches the end of the church age or the end of planet Earth, please send that to me, and I will deal with that in one of the upcoming segments. But until then, we'll see you next time. I'm going to cut her short right there. I just wanted to clarify a few things and let you know where we're going to go from here. So question, comments, those are always welcome. So stick with me on this one, folks. I appreciate you watching. Keep the questions coming, and I will address them as I get them. See you next round. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.